Hey guys, my name's Mike. I'm an author and a comic book artist, and today we're doing this Rasputin and Hellboy commission. And the buyer asked me to put some Magnolia-y elements into it, which meant that I had to think a lot about inking style. So while this is playing, and it took about, I think it's running at 4 times, it took me about 2 hours, and then maybe a half hour into this sketch. And then of course I have to color it. So maybe 4 hours total, 4.5. And if you're wondering, this is the digital commission. I'm doing this digitally, and then I'm going to print it out on 11 by 17 poster with archival ink and send him that and the original art. And if you're curious, something like that would be about $100 for a single character. But I want to talk about inking style. So I had to sort of take apart what does it mean? What is a Mike Mignola element? Other than, you think Mignola, you think heavy blacks and negative space. But I don't think that that's the defining part of his inking style. The most important part to everybody is form, the way you see shapes, how shapes are interpreted, proportionality. That's what really makes you who you are. It doesn't really matter that, I mean, he's going to draw, if he could draw Hellboy on a chalkboard, and it's still going to look different than a Hellboy that I would draw. And it doesn't matter about level of detail. And I think Mignola's work is widely considered to be, it's very minimal and undetailed, but I completely disagree that it's very exacting. It's very planned. It's super tight. Even though it's strange. It looks very, very loose, and the hatching looks almost childlike, and it's these uniform things. You're like, oh, but that is not easy to do by any stretch of the imagination. It would be much easier to be more gestural and really be more detailed. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do for Mignola-y elements, other than I did the Rasputin is nothing like the Rasputin that appears in Seed of Destruction. And this really isn't supposed to be a scene from Seed of Destruction, even though there is the Octopus thing, the Agdru Jihad. It's just it's just fun to tangle up Hellboy, and then I put, it's a vague interpretation of that. It's not supposed to be like, this is a scene from the comic, this is a moment. It's not supposed to be that. It's just fun, and Hellboy's swinging at the thing, and he's all pissed off, and yeah. So inking style. The first thing that I looked at was line weight, because that's such an important and often overlooked thing, how you vary your line weight. I prefer to ink everything. I like to finish inking digitally, but if I was doing like a comic, I would greatly prefer to do the regular pencils and then ink it all with microns and with a quill brush, a G pen, which tools are an important part of that too, and I'll get to that. We'll talk about digital tools, and we'll talk about physical tools. I really don't like that hand of doom there. I hope I redraw it. I don't really remember. I'm recording this the day after. So I did this yesterday, and it turned out pretty well. It's still not colored. So this underdrawing is just it's like an 8 by 10 sketchbook drawing that I tore out. And that's usually how I'll do commissions. I'll start them with an 8 by 10 drawing, get kind of block in, and some are more detailed than others. This one, I wasn't really sure on the composition and how all these octopus parts would fit in, but I'm happy with how it turned out. That was a Mignola cover of Rasputin, and I was just looking for the details, because all I could really remember is that the dragon thing looks just like the dragon from the cover of, the Storm and the Fury, which I actually drew once. I drew the exact cover. I wanted a poster of the cover, and I couldn't find a high resolution scan, so I just drew I didn't want the Hellboy thing on there. I just wanted a poster of that big orange weird thing. I have a video where I color it a little bit like Mignola. Or not like Mignola, but like Dave Stewart. Speaking of Dave Stewart, I had never read the work he did in 2011 and forward on Conan. I'm doing a fantasy comic right now, and so I'm trying to read all the fantasy comics I possibly can, and Conan seems like a pretty obvious one. I grew up kind of on fantasy comics. I love Battle Chasers and Joe Mad's work. But anyways, Dave Stewart's work on Conan, which is just pencils, is really awesome. So here, I'm just using a line art pen, and that just means it doesn't have any kind of size jitter on it. It's just like a micron pen. Which is how I prefer to ink. I like very thin lines and a relatively good amount of detail. Because I started in art digital painting, so I see everything as color, and it changes. I like to leave my line art nice and open, so I can add color to it, which is sort of the opposite of what Mike Mignola does. Given that he has Hellboy's kind of it's colored a lot like watercolor. Lots of but not as, but with values that are crunched together. And I'm not going to color this anything like, the Dave Stewart's work on Hellboy. I just don't, the line art just isn't the same. None of it is really the same. And I'm pecking away at details. I'm using a G pen here, which has a huge size jitter, to sort of simulate using a, I wouldn't say, the G pen the digital G pen doesn't work anything like a real G pen. It doesn't feel anything like a real G pen, but it's in Manga Studio, the G pen brush is one of the best brushes. The problem is that when you tend to end lines, they trail off very, very fine. So you get lots of very pointed lines, and that shape at the end of your line is incredibly important when it comes to your inking style, because Mike Mignola, almost none of his lines anywhere come to a point. They're all sort of either rounded, and if they come to a point, they're like rounded, even points. So if you see there's plenty of hatching in Hellboy, but it's like these even juts that look like they're done. They look like they're kind of the shape of a Sharpie head. I don't know that he uses a Sharpie. I've seen plenty. I've held plenty of Mignola's inks in my hands and looked at them, and it's all brushed. All of the big black areas it's clearly India ink and brush. Which, he's an old school comic guy. That doesn't surprise me in the least. So here I'm just putting some big chunks of shadows in. This is where, this is why I don't understand why most comic artists don't do hybrid, because what I just did right there was so incredibly fast compared to brushing all that in if you've never used India ink. However, all the detail work, you would think it would be faster digital. It's not. It's much faster if you can just flip that chunk of Bristol or whatever you're drawing on around in your hand, and especially things like hatching and drawing faces. It's just so much faster traditionally, at least for me. But the bigger, thicker stuff is much faster. So I'm trying not to if you see right where I pulled off up there on the shoulder, how it's got that really fine point. That is a very not Mignola-y element. And the only time that would be in my work is where just what a micron pen can do. And it can put a little bit of an edge, but I tend not to. I like to use big fat nibs. If you're ever blocking in a bunch of ink, I picked that up from Matteo Scalera, who is maybe my favorite inker. He's not he's a penciler too, but he's just, the guy's the king to me. I absolutely love him. I love Black Science and Veil and the Outcast, and he did Secret Avengers and some Deadpool work, and everything he does is just amazing. I could have drawn these hands so much faster if I couldn't back it up. I would have just drawn what was there. That's another problem with digital, is that I keep trying to change things. So here I'm using a big marker. This is a huge advantage for digital, if you've never used a trick like this, I use the wrong brush here. I use a brush that's not 100% black. See how it says silhouette there? My silhouette brush has tons of anti-aliasing and there's tons of gray pixels. So it filled with a bunch of gray pixels, which was super bad. And what I should have been using is a flat brush or one of the inking brushes. And that it cost me a bunch of time, probably 15 minutes. But here I'm doing big black silhouettes, and then I can actually see. Maybe I just didn't have black selected. I can see it now in the, I couldn't see it when I was doing it, that I'm missing pixels. But I can actually see the gray in there. Can you see the gray in the middle of the dragon thing? I'm still not totally sure why that happened. It's never happened to me before. I just was using the wrong brush. That's what happened. So, anyways, I'm making these big black silhouettes, which would be, that's kind of how Magnola did it, but I'm going to, see here I'm having trouble selecting. I'm going to select them. I'm going to make a selection of these black lines. I have them on a separate layer. And then I'm going to reduce the edges by a few pixels, and then I'm going to delete the middle so I have nice even line art. And here I'm fussing and I can't figure out why this isn't working. I have to go in here like 2 or 3 times and delete these pixels. I'm still not totally sure what happened, other than I used the wrong brush. I was very annoyed when I was doing it. And my dog wanted to go for a walk, and I was just screaming at the dog like it's his fault. Shut up. I prefer to work. It's like a thing with streamers and some of these really great artist people out there that everyone works over top of red now, and red pencil lead. I got some red pencil lead just because I was curious, and it just doesn't work for me. My eyes prefer blue. I like to draw over blue. So that's what I'm going to do. And then I just did the same thing here, only I used the right brush, so it was real quick, and it actually saved me time. Not sure why I gave his fingers claws. You know, details like that has nothing to do with your style per se. But what I noticed when it comes to to inking style, like when I wanted to make things more Magnola-y, what I did was sort of reduce shapes to their most basic. Like the more you reduce something, like the less detail you have, the more evocative it needs to be, like the actual shape of it. Like I made sort of a if you'll notice in a lot of Hellboy covers, like when light is coming out of like the big areas of light are usually bounded by almost straight lines, whether it's like something coming out of Hellboy's mouth or a big area of fire or whatever. But it's actually really difficult to get those to sort of invoke what you want them to when the shapes are so simple. So I feel like you need to almost be more accurate. And I couldn't decide. Like I'm like, where do I want his thumb? What do I want it doing? Probably should have looked at some Mignola drawings just to see his hand positioning is, that's another thing, like what you consider a gestural position with your hands. You'll sort of see similar poses across artists' work. No. While I'm recording over this, I'm going to open up the finished image because I don't remember exactly what I did. And you can find the finished image on my DeviantArt page. There's a link below if you want to color it or download it or do whatever with it. I don't have the colored version up yet, but I have the inks. What did I call that? Oh, Rasputin.png. That's probably it. Yeah, so when I look at the finished version of Rasputin, I don't see. I mean, there's a hard light coming from the right, and there's a lot of black. But if I were to show you just that character by itself, I don't think it looks particularly Mignola-y. Hellboy is in a sort of classic Hellboy pose, and he looks like a Mignola's Hellboy, but with a fatter face. And I gave him a ponytail, like the a nod to the Ron Perlman version. And the fact that we're getting another movie, which is pretty exciting. It's not going to be Guillermo del Toro, I don't think, which is Mignola does I think those guys were such a natural pairing because del Toro is just known for doing like these crazy organic like monsters that are truly original, and Mignola too. Even though a lot of Mignola's monsters look the same, but they all look like Mignola's monsters. And I think that's important. What I'm doing right here, like in his beard, this would never fly in a Hellboy comic. This lassoed out, filled thing. And there are a bunch of, I didn't have scaling on. Normally when you get that white ring, in Manga Studio, it's very easy to keep that from happening. But this is at such a high DPI. It's just 1 pixel, and I'm at 600 DPI, and that stuff just won't show up even if you printed it out at like 40 inches or something, it still wouldn't show up. So you don't have to worry about it. A lot of those loose pixels. I mean, unless you have I'm a little bit, I don't want to say OCD, but I can be compulsive about it in a way, and it just isn't important. It just won't show up. As far as the inking tools that I'm using, if I were doing this traditionally, or I were doing it without trying to invoke anyone else's work, I would just be using the Micron pen and then like the G pen. And that's how I work traditionally too. I use just microns, and then I use nibs. And I'm trying to incorporate more and more nibs the more I sort of study what Matteo Scalera has been doing to just create incredible detail with an incredibly visceral, energetic style. And then I love Sean Gordon Murphy too, and his work on Batman. That guy's amazing. And I mean, there's tons of people that I love, but I think it's time for me to move on and do this silly octopus. So the light here that I'm working with, like in my mind, is from the bottom right. And then I also end up having light from his hand, as if his hand was I did the Mignola, like your hand or your mouth or your whatever is magic. But instead of it being think about what they do with Doctor Strange. Yeah, see how it's just this big open space, and you got to have the right little turns in there. And if you have the right little turns, it will take on a very Mignola quality. I'm sure I probably Googled. Usually when I Google, I'll pull it over onto the monitor that I work on. but I'm not sure if I did that or not. So here I'm using, this is called Shelly. Shelly is a C-Tech pen that simulates Shel Silverstein's minor size jitter on his illustration work, because that was, that was the first art that I ever loved. And this type of pen is super important to my work. It has a very loose, liquid, messy quality. It bleeds. If you see all those little dots are all over the place, where as if it was ink welling. It took me eons to get that to feel the way I want it to feel, even though it's just a round-headed brush with size jitter, basically. But it's my favorite brush. It's not super conducive to comic book work, but it's great for backgrounds, and it's great for loose, sort of visceral cartooning, I would say. And notice that even though I have 500 brushes loaded for 95% of the commissions and the work I do and the comic book stuff I do, whether it's coloring or drawing, it's just this list of, I don't know, there's probably 15 brushes there. And that includes a pencil, a paintbrush, a flats brush, a big goofy marker. Like, I mean, 4 of those are just round-headed brush. They're all the same round-headed brushes with different settings, like super low-tech crap. Coloring, maybe that's not so much the case. I tend to use a lot of brushes, and I have I love and try and emulate so many different styles. I'm just playing around. I don't know if I end up removing all those. I thought about, if you see those like slashes inside each one of those, I was like, oh, I'll do like a horror skin thing where it's like folded skin. I'll get in there and add detail. And since all of that background is kind of set right on top of Rasputin, if I were to have colored that the way I originally intended, it would have, like, you wouldn't have been able to see him, and Hellboy would have gotten lost, and that's just no good. So I ended up going a lot more loose with the octopus than I thought, and sort of I don't want to say like cartoony. I mean, it's kind of cartoony, but it's just I went in and I deleted all those little things. And it's just more fun, I guess. Whereas, I don't know how to characterize my style. I guess it's like loose, visceral cartooning. Cartoony. Whereas, because I'm not like hyper detailed, but I like a little bit. Whereas, like, say, Joe Mad, that would be very tight, semi-visceral cartooning. He's got but there's elements when you have big open areas of line art that aren't hyper rendered. At this point, I started to get a little bit nervous because there weren't really enough. The guy had requested Mignola elements, and I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. And I knew I'd have to do some type of silhouetting. So at a certain point, and we're getting fairly close to the end of the video, I think that I start filling in black areas rather than, if you saw, I drew that there was going to be water down there, and I had an idea to make this like a more three-dimensional thing, and not this washed out, or not washed out, but like silhouetted out with the magic effect wasn't intended at all. That was the only way that, I guess that angular slash of color running through the drawing that's up behind Hellboy, that kind of serves as his backdrop. And I don't think I drew the rest of it's not drawn in right now. Maybe it is. I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention. I wasn't looking at the video. But that's very indicative of Mignola's style, and many of his covers have that. So I did like a 2-pixel, just tiny little silhouettes, which isn't very Hellboy of me. But again, I didn't want this to, I'm not trying to recreate a Mignola drawing. I'm just trying to, well, I'm trying to make the buyer happy. But also at the end of the day, when you draw something, it's going to look like you most of the time. Unless you have like model sheets or something and you can keep going back and checking. And by model sheets, I mean, what a video game designer or someone would use, or an animator, to keep drawing the same thing over and over. And if you see the little details, like where the hatching is in his headband, even though those aren't Mignola shapes, they are super flat, round-headed hatches, and that is much more Mignola-y than anything that I would do without having that in mind. His eyes didn't look right to me. They're kind of more rounded at the bottom and not so triangular. Trying to figure that out. And I'm just using my sort of, it's kind of like a C-Tech pen, Shelly. But I'll put my standard brushes, I will put those up on my Gumroad page. I just did my first watercolor brush set that's available for sale, and I'll export my standard brushes and just put them up there for anyone that wants them. So there'll be a link to that below. And if those brushes aren't up, these 16 just like classic brushes, they'll be up shortly. Drawn hands are really interesting in that this hand is super tiny, given that it's going to be printed, it's going to be less than a ½ inch, less than a ¼ inch really. And what looks good as a super detailed hand up close, if that hand was huge, will not necessarily look good. See, when you zoom out, it actually looks okay. And I don't necessarily have trouble drawing hands and feet. I mean, that look like hands and feet. Some people really just, the physics of a hand confuse some people, and I get that. In my first couple months when I was, just figure drawing and not really drawing anything, I just got the classic books, like the Byrne Hogarth dynamic figure drawing book, and just drew everything in there 10 times, and that really helped me. So if that's a concern for you, if it's hard for you to picture what a hand looks like as you turn it, I guess the best thing about hands is that you can always just look at your own, even though mine isn't very superhero-y. Excuse me. Still have just the end of a cold. Up here I'm deleting those lines. I wasn't sure if this was in the video. There's some detail work that I didn't draw on the right-handed Doom. There needed to be some slashes and stuff to make it look like Mignola. I went back and did that. Those long pauses are a couple minutes long, where I'm like, how am I going to make this thing look like Mike Mignola? Notice how fast that worked. Just a couple fills, and I was like, we're close, but we need a silhouette, we need a border, because the rest of the lines, we have all these like really, the lines of the Octopus, they look like my lines. They're loose, and they're kind of gestural, and they're kind of sloppy, and they're those ink glops. So I put that small white 1 pixel border in there to try and tighten it up just a bit. And I thought that I would be able to use that when I colored it to have that would just be the rim light, and then I wouldn't have any rendering on the inside, which is not, I mean, I am a texture brush junkie. I'm really sorry about that. So this is just about the end of the video. I go back and tighten some things up, but this was where I was satisfied and where the dog was ready to go for a walk. So I thank you for watching. If you want to download the image, there's a link below. If you're interested in commission, feel free to contact me. My Twitter is below. You can tweet at me. You can leave a comment here. If you have a question about something I did, you have a question about a brush in Mega Studio or Photoshop, whatever you need, feel free to just leave a message and I'll get back to you. And I appreciate you spending some time with me. I hope I've offered a little bit of insight. I'm not sure I talked about all the things I thought about in respect to inking style, but there's always more of these to do. So, if you're a colorist, feel free to download the file and color it. Color it on YouTube. Just provide a link. Make sure you say it's my work. Don't erase my signature. That's why that stuff's up there. So, thanks guys.